Hey Changemaker, welcome back. I am Julia Wiklander, your host of the Hey Changemaker podcast and the founder of Girls Globe, the global feminist media platform for gender equality, human rights, social justice, and sustainability. This is our 20th episode of the Hey Changemaker podcast. It has been such an incredible journey. I knew for a very long time that I wanted to create a podcast that would inspire me and other changemakers by having conversations with others who share their experiences and share the challenges and about how they manage. It is just such a hard choice to choose work that requires us to take risks, break norms, and stand up against things. We're not going with the flow of existing power structures. We're stepping into our innate power, which can be incredibly challenging. At the same time, we face setbacks and obstacles, and still, time and time again, we rise with hope and love and solidarity. I am so incredibly grateful that you've been a part of this journey so far. The Hey Changemaker podcast only launched in October last year. And so far, we've reached listeners in over 47 countries, from Pakistan to Paraguay and from New Zealand to the Netherlands. I know that you care about creating change, and I know that the only way we can see sustainable change is by building movements together, by learning from each other and standing up in solidarity across borders and across continents. So if you haven't yet, please hit subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening to it. And please share an episode with someone you think could be encouraged, inspired, or helped. Because feeling alone in the struggle for equality, human rights, justice, and sustainability can really break our hope. And this podcast is all about strengthening our hope instead. And with that said, I'm so excited about sharing this episode with you. My guest today is Ruchira Gupta, an author and activist who believes in a world in which no child is bought or sold. After winning an Emmy for her documentary on sex trafficking, she set up an NGO called Apne Up that has helped thousands of girls and women exit systems of sexual exploitation. She has worked with the UN to change laws and policies in countries all over the world to end sex trafficking. I first heard about Ruchira's work many years ago when it was shared by Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Woodoon in their book Half the Sky. And this conversation does take me back to when I was in Mumbai studying population issues and human trafficking. We will talk about her amazing work, her upcoming book, her debut novel, I Kick and I Fly, which is based on experiences related to her, and the change that she has seen and the challenges that remain. She shares personal stories and truly a message of hope. Ruchira Gupta, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for joining me on the Hey Changemaker podcast.
I'm so happy to be on your podcast because I love your country, Sweden, and I love the cause that your NGO, Girls Globe, advocates and stands for.
Thank you so much. There's so much to talk to you about, and I would love, as I ask many of our guests, to start off to share a story of a moment when you realized that you wanted to be a change maker, that you just felt like you had to do something more to create positive change. Can you start off with sharing a bit of a story?
There are a few pivotal moments. The most striking one is what made me take a stand against sex trafficking was when I was traveling through the hills of Nepal. I came across rows of villages which didn't have any girls from age 15 to 45. And I was really shocked because, like I couldn't understand how so many girls could be missing. So I asked the men who were drinking tea, playing cards, where the girls were. And they said that they all are in Bombay. Now, these villages are very remote up in the Himalayas, 1,400 kilometers from the town of Bombay. So I couldn't understand how this was happening. I was a journalist. And so, like a good journalist, I began to look for the answer. And the answer changed my life because I found that a smooth supply chain existed from these very remote hamlets all the way to the brothels of Bombay. And I saw that little girls between the ages of 9 and 13 were sold by poor and starving farmers who didn't know what Mumbai or Bombay represented. And they would let their daughters go for $50, $100 to find a job in the big city. Sometimes even think, yes, they might be in prostitution, but they thought that this meant roof, food, and the girls would be better off. And they would let these daughters go. And then there were these transporters, agents, corrupt border guards, pimps, brothel managers, financiers, money lenders, landlords, organized criminal
Mm.
networks, all running this smooth supply chain from these villages to the brothels. And behind them, of course, were the customers who were buying these little girls
Mm.
for as little as 30 cents, 50 cents per rape. What I saw was that once these girls were taken to the brothels, they were locked up in tiny rooms for years and just trotted out for these customers again and again till their bodies were completely used up. And then, if they had children, then they were told that their children would be put into the same position to replace them.
Mm.
As a journalist, I had covered war and famine and hunger, and I had seen a lot of violence, but I had never seen this kind of intimate violence, that too on this
Mm.
scale of little girls. So I decided to do something about it. I ended up making a documentary on the
Mm.
subject called The Selling of Innocence. I won an Emmy for it. But somehow when I was on stage looking at all the bright lights, when I received the award, I wanted to do something more. I wanted to use the documentary to make a difference. I
Mm.
didn't wanted to, start my career as a documentary filmmaker, but I wanted to
Mm.
use it to make a difference. So I went back with the award to the women who had told their stories in my film, and I said, "What can I do?" And they said, "We want to educate our daughters because we don't want our daughters to have the same future as ourselves." And so, with the 22 women, I started an NGO called Apne Aap with the
Mm.
aim of educating their children. We didn't know how. I wasn't a doctor, a social worker, a lawyer, but we put a straw mat on the floor and we hired a teacher in a community school in the red light district and began. And now, it's almost 2 decades later. I can
Mm.
report that we have educated thousands of daughters of prostituted women in school,
Mm.
prevented them from being trafficked, and helped the mothers also organize, seek their government entitlements like low cost food and housing, and be able to get out of systems of exploitation.
Mm. That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that, Ruchira, sharing that personal perspective. And just in last year alone, I read that 800 kids have been able to go to school through APNAP. 51 women in 1 year alone have given opportunities to learn a livelihood, and food and hygiene has been provided to over 30,000 women and girls. So, I mean, it's incredibly impressive what has been done just in 1 year alone. And APNAP, you founded it, yeah, 2002. So that is 20 years ago. So tell me a little bit about sort of the change that you've seen since then. I mean, India and Mumbai, I mean, has of course developed in those 2 decades. Also, given that India is now the world's most populous country, with a very large population that is below the age of 30. How do you see that these sort of changes have impacted the industry, the sex trafficking industry in India? And do you have you seen any other changes during these 20 years?
In these 20 years, I have seen changes which are positive, and that's why I'm full of hope and I feel kind of triumphant. Because when I began working on the issue, as I said, I saw little girls locked up in rooms being trotted out for multiple customers. And that time, there were hardly any NGOs. The laws were punishing the women instead of punishing the traffickers and the customers who were raping the girls. So I didn't know what could be done. And 20 years later, I can report that my NGO, Apne Aap, has helped more than 20,000 women and girls get out of systems of exploitation. So we have brought about change girl by girl, woman by woman for the individual. But also at the same time, as these girls and women began to get services and began to learn that they could get out, they became more empowered and they started forming circles, which we call mandalas in the Buddhist term. And they are the Mahila mandalas, which are women's circles of small groups of 10. And then we federated into larger and larger groups to be able to advocate for legal and policy change so that women could get services to get out from the government. And even while they were in prostitution, food, clothing, shelter, basic needs, right?
Yeah.
And support for the education of their children, plus bank loans and skills training to start new jobs. And at the same time, we advocated for changes in the law to be able to punish the traffickers and the customers because sex trafficking is such a demand driven industry. If there was no customer, there would be no profit motive for the trafficker who would not have he would not be going out into the villages to look for poor low caste girls to prey upon. So, I saw this change law by law. The women of Apne Aap organized, marched on the streets, and I took them to speak in parliament along with me to ask for a change in law, which would shift the blame from the victim to the perpetrator, punish the customer, and invest in more choices for at risk girls and women and services for those who wanted to get out. And we have that law now. It is known as Section 370 of the Indian Penal Code. But I began to do this legal change because I realized that if I keep doing girl by girl, I'm fishing upstream because the traffickers are ahead of me. So if we can have laws, so I even took my documentary, The Selling of Innocence, and screened it at the UN and then to the US Senate and then to other places across the world, also including India, uh, to explain to people that human trafficking looked like this in human terms, that there was this girl who was controlled by all kinds of people. There were these traffickers who bought her and sold her, and then there were the customers. I showed it as a system and was able to convince senators and congressmen in the US Senate to create and pass the first Trafficking Victim Protection Act. Same thing in the United Nations. I worked with friends and allies, many NGOs across the world who were realizing the same thing to get the UN protocol to end trafficking in persons passed. Because, the last 2 decades have been different from the previous decades in terms of trafficking. Trafficking has taken on a new dimension. The numbers are going up, the ages are coming down, as the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime tells us in the data that they put out every year.
Yeah.
It's the third largest crime in the world, only second to arms trade and drugs trade. And some people say maybe it's crossed the drugs trade in terms of billions of dollars being made off it. Because drugs are consumed once and girls can be consumed again and again.
Yeah.
But I want to mention that what the last 2 decades have shown me is that a solution does exist. And which I have, of course, done in my own small way through my NGO Apnea, but it can be replicated, investing in the basic needs of the person that I call the last girl, who is the most at risk to being trafficked because she's poor, because she's female, because she's from a marginalized group like oppressed caste or race, and because she's a teenager. So if we invest in her basic needs and if we create legal infrastructure to punish those who buy and sell her,
Yeah.
I think we can make a dent, as I have shown, and
Mm.
especially investment in the education
Yeah.
of poor and marginalized girls.
Mm.
It really triggers change. The Yeah,
Yeah.
there's more I can say,
Yeah.
but this.
Mm. Thank you so much for just painting that whole picture and the history and the change that you've seen and the positive impact that you've had. And of course, I mean, the challenges remain. And as we're seeing sort of governments shifting policies and new sort of right-wing movements in different parts of the world, I mean, a lot of things are interlinked, right, in these developments. So it's yeah, interesting, and it's important to have that perspective that you're sharing. So you are releasing a new book called I Kick and I Fly, and it covers the amazing story of a 14-year-old girl who finds herself at risk of being sold. Can you tell us a little bit about your motivation to writing this book? Because it is a young adult fiction, as I understand it. So tell me a little bit more about the book.
I began writing I Kick and I Fly when a girl in my NGO, Apne Aap, won a gold medal in a small village in the red light area of Forbisganj in Bihar in India. And that girl was from a nomadic tribe. She was about to be sold into prostitution when a women's right advocate basically enrolled her in a kung fu program. And through the practice of kung fu, she began to learn the power of her body and then to fight for it. So it's very similar to what actually happened that I saw in my NGO Apne Aap. Because the girl who won the gold medal in karate actually told me that she said, Didi, learning self defense, I learned that I have a self worth defending. So it just changed things around for her. She stopped being bullied in school. She began to respect herself. Her grades began to be better. And when she won the gold medal, the school kids, the principal, everyone began to respect her, but also her community began to respect her and they began to think they were worth something too. So her courage began to infect the community. And it was not just one girl, there were many girls who were part of our karate program and who are still part of our karate program. And things really changed for them when they began to discover the power of their body. So I saw the importance of body
Yeah.
empowerment. I saw the importance of self worth as a tool to stand up to bullying, to trafficking, ev- to even to hunger. The funny thing is that, if a community begins to believe that it can change and the women begin to organize to bring about the change, standing up to terrible husbands and pimps and traffickers who are beating them, in very small ways, in a small community, they can bring about change. And then during COVID, I began writing the book when the girl won the gold medal and then stopped writing it for a few years because I had so much work to do doing the actual activism. And then during COVID, I had time to pause because I was in Forbisganj in my childhood home with my parents for 5 months. And, I could see all the despair all around me. But I said, I also was meeting the girls who had been through this karate program, who had, finished school and become graduates, and they would come by to say hello to me. So I thought I need to share this with other young people that change is possible. Standing up to injustice can win, and communities can organize. I wanted to share the story of hope because I also saw that in Forbisganj, where Apne Aap had started working, when I had begun working there 22 years ago, there were 72 brothels, and today there are just two brothels because because the traffickers are in jail.
Yeah.
And women have taken over those mud huts and turned them into homes and small businesses for themselves. And the children are in school and college.
Amazing.
So it's a very different model of change and hope. A girl having the courage, the community organizing, women coming together. And that's all there in this book. It's about hope. This book is about
Yeah.
hope.
Oh, and you shine so much hope when you're speaking. I mean, just your smile and everything. I feel like, the issues that you have been working, against and the horrible traumas that these women and girls have endured are just unspeakable in so many ways, and still they just need to be spoken, and they need to be shared for change to be able to happen. So I mean, I'm just so inspired by the hope that you remain, that you have.
Yeah, and that's
Mm,
that's why I wrote this book, because I want young people to know that things like this happen to people their
mm,
age. But I also want young people to know that they can do
yeah.
something about it and stand up to
Mm,
injustice. So, I hope they read the book and they share the book, because it will give them also some clues in their own lives. This girl who is the main character in the book, her name is Hira, which means diamond in Hindi, is a diamond in the dust, and her courage, she comes from nothing, but she turns a crisis into an
mm,
opportunity. She stands up to bullying, she stands up to racism,
mm,
she stands up to hunger, homelessness, and poverty in different
mm,
ways, and body shaming.
mm,
So I think kids will find some clues in this book which could save
yeah.
lives. And I think parents and teachers will find a very valuable tool in this book to be able to talk to young
Mm,
people about issues which are in plain sight but invisible, because nobody knows how to talk
yeah.
about sex, about sexuality, about sexual exploitation, body shaming, body
Mm,
commodification, toxic
yeah.
masculinity, all these things. But this book provides an age appropriate way to
Mm,
talk. I'm hoping, and it's about hope,
yeah.
and so it's a good way to talk to people
Yeah.
about a tough
Yeah,
subject.
absolutely. And I feel like it's touching upon your own motivation, I think, in your work, because it's easy to, I mean, of course, I'm assuming that you've had many, many times where you've been very angry and very upset about what's happening and what's going on and what has, what these women and girls have endured. How have you navigated that to continue to be motivated by hope? Because I mean, and not get too frustrated and angry. Um, just share a little bit about how you navigate that personally.
I navigate the trauma, because we have to accept that when you deal with trauma, you do begin to suffer from secondary
Yeah.
trauma. And once, I was having this conversation with a survivor of prostitution who was speaking to a journalist. And she told me, she said, Didi, I'm tired of telling my story again and
Yeah.
again. So I said, multiply you telling your story to one journalist into me telling all your stories to many journalists 20,000
Yeah.
times. And think about how I feel saying that story again and
Yeah.
again. So we are in this together in solidarity as women, because we have to speak
Yeah.
up. So I think one of the ways I deal with the trauma is speaking up, because the moment you tell a story, it heals,
Yeah.
it's healing. The second way I deal with it is through writing, because I write. And, again, it's storytelling, but it also puts words on paper and you externalize all the pain and the
Yeah.
suffering. The third way is by doing something about it. So, going to parliament and asking for a change in
Mm.
law, or marching with the women and saying that the trafficker needs to be arrested, or even filing a case against a trafficker, or getting a girl out of a
Yeah.
brothel. That is very satisfying. Like if a girl graduates from college and sends me a photograph of herself with her graduation
Yeah.
certificate, it's a happy moment.
Yes.
Or someone wins a gold medal in karate or kung fu, and I know where that girl came from. It's a proud
Mm.
moment. So that I feel very good about. And in my own way, I have a group of friends and family who I are my support system, and I talk to them a lot. And they are from all ages, from Gloria Steinem, who's in her 80s, to my niece, who's 13, And, I talk to them about different subjects. We organize, we fight, we struggle, we laugh, we
Mm,
dance, we go out for dinner
mm,
together. Um, and that is fantastic. But also, I find art
yeah.
and creativity are very healing. I love painting.
Mm,
And I paint hope. I always tell people I'm an outsider to the art world. I'm not a trained artist. In fact, the last time I painted was when I was 14 years old in school, and then I didn't touch my paint brushes till the COVID
mm,
year. Then I found my old school drawing book and paints, and I began to paint the hope I saw in my mother's garden.
mm,
Nature was burst, it was monsoon, and nature was regenerating
yeah.
itself. There were green shoots and water pouring from the clouds, and squirrels scampering, and snails inching forward, and flowers blossoming. And it gave me so much peace and healing because, you know, life does start
Mm,
again. And I wanted to share that with myself at that moment. So I began to paint it. I said, I have to bottle this
mm,
moment. And I bottled it in a painting. And then I shared it with the world because really, I'm an outsider to the art
mm,
world. But all I do through my writing and painting is I paint hope.
mm,
I write hope.
mm. Oh, I love that. And I saw your art and I was so inspired by just, your multi-passionate self being, a journalist, being a creative, a writer, an artist, an entrepreneur, an Emmy award-winning documentary filmmaker. I mean, there are so many things, and I think that it's inspiring because sometimes as change makers, we think that there's only one path and there's only one way to do things. And I love that you've embraced sort of those many passions. Yeah,
Yeah. It's very interesting because sometimes, of course, the work that we do is so hard that you want to give
yeah,
up. For every girl that I talk about, there are others who didn't make it, right?
mm,
And situations, even in my own personal life, which I could do nothing about. Like I may have lost a friend, and I couldn't explain to her why I was so obsessed with sex trafficking
mm,
and couldn't go out with her for dinner or something,
yeah,
right? And then you slowly drift apart, and then you regret that, and you want to tell her that it's not that you didn't have time, but you were just not, you just had other
yeah,
priorities or
yeah,
whatever, right? And or other issues. And I realized my grandmother, or sometimes you don't find the solution to a very hard problem, and my grandmother would say that, Ruchi, when one door shuts, a window
mm,
opens. And I have literally found that because I keep inventing different ways of tackling this huge problem of human trafficking and child sexual
mm,
trafficking, especially. And I keep inventing different ways. If I can't use the law, I'll use
mm,
education. If I can't use education, I will use painting. If I can't use painting, I will use
mm,
writing. But I will keep building the movement
mm,
for a world in which no girl or woman is bought or
yeah.
sold.
That's so inspiring, and I think that it's helpful for all of our listeners. This is a podcast for change makers, so I think just for everyone who's listening, just to know that we can continue and not give up. I think the resilience that you're showing through the work that you've done is incredibly inspiring. Um, so, what would you say to change makers, young change makers today who are hoping to perhaps harness their own creativity to advocate for, to create change in their communities or even the world?
I would say you can do four things at any given moment in your life. You can learn about an issue which matters to you. In my case, I would say learn about sex
Mm,
trafficking. You can act on it by volunteering or fundraising for a girl or a boy who's of less privilege than you, because it will make you feel better and you will create a better world in which you live in. So it's good both
mm,
ways. The third thing you can do is advocate. So you probably have ways of writing to your local member of parliament or senator, and telling them to keep issues of exploitation of girls and boys front and center in their policies. I have a pledge on my website, ruchiragupta.com, which you can sign, which goes directly to the UN, asking them to remember the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 5, which is about gender based violence. And you can buy my book and share the story with other kids because it might give them some clues to deal with difficult issues in their own lives, from bullying to sexual exploitation. But also, you'll share the story of a girl in India who succeeded against sex trafficking, which might give hope.
Mm.
And, choose a topic you like, but these are the four
Yeah.
ways. Act
Mm.
is what I would
Yeah.
say. Don't get daunted. Nothing is big or small. Only time shows whether it was big or small, but do it as if it
Mm.
matters.
Amazing. And how do you care for yourself today? What are your are you continuing to use your art although you're not um in your parents' garden?
I always have a little art book with me and some paint brushes and a few paint boxes with me when I travel. So I have that. I'm traveling right
Mm.
now. And I will paint the clouds today because it just stopped raining and the sun is out and it's looking beautiful.
Mm.
And I'm trying to figure out how to paint raindrops to catch the transparency of raindrops. So that's what I'll
Mm.
do. And I'll go for a walk along the creek. I walk 10,000 steps every day and I look at nature when I walk, the birds and the grass and the water and whatever I can see around me. If I'm in New York, I walk the sidewalks and look into the
Mm.
cafes. But I like seeing life around
Yeah.
me.
Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for sharing all of the hope that you are just bursting with. And I'm feeling it all the way across the continents. I'm sure that everyone who will listen to this episode will feel your message of hope as well. Um, and
Thank you,
and I'm really
Julia.
looking forward to the release of your book.
You can pre-order I Kick and I Fly already. It's available on all the online channels. So it's available.
What a change maker. To learn more about Ruchira Gupta and order her upcoming book, I Kick and I Fly, go to ruchiragupta.com. You can also learn more about Apna Up via their website, and you'll find all the links in the episode show notes wherever you're listening to this episode. And if you have any thoughts after listening to this episode, go to girlsglobe.org/changemaker and share a comment or question under this episode. As I mentioned in the introduction, this is our 20th episode. It has been such a pleasure and, most importantly, a boost of hope and positivity to speak with so many amazing changemakers and to share these conversations with you. So, as we continue this podcasting journey together, I want to invite you to share your comments, your questions, or your thoughts in a voice message. Do you have any concerns in your work as a changemaker that you'd like us to discuss? Do you have questions for me or about Girls Globe? Do you have any comments or additions you'd like to make to the conversations that we've had so far? Perhaps you want to tell us about what you like about this podcast. Or maybe you just have an inspirational message to share with our global community of changemakers. Whatever it may be, go to girlsglobe.org/changemaker and scroll to the section called Leave a Message or Ask a Question. Once you've recorded and submitted your recording, we will review and may very well use your question or comment in an upcoming episode, or even as the basis of a conversation. I am really, really looking forward to hearing from you. This is a weekly podcast. However, we will be taking a 1-month break to review, improve, and leave some time to prepare future episodes of the Hey Changemaker podcast. These first 20 episodes have been so much fun to make, and I'm really looking forward to continuing these important conversations for you and hopefully with you. This will also give you time to listen to any episodes that you've missed so far or re-listen to the ones that you've enjoyed. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for listening and learning. See you soon, Changemaker.